Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Economic Times and Pearson Excellence and Innovation in Education series. I'm Shambhavi Jha from ET, welcoming you all to this webinar. To talk a bit about the topic of discussion today, 2020 and 2021 have been the years of change and innovation, especially for the education and technology sector. The EdTech community made tremendous advances to address students' needs. Although the updates on testing and vaccination for the COVID-19 pandemic dominated our news feeds, there were many other innovations taking place behind the scenes, especially in the field of education. The walls of classrooms are constantly being demolished by technology with every passing day. It has enabled new ways of learning, communicating, and working collaboratively. The advent of digital classroom is challenging the traditional methods of teaching and welcoming innovations that couldn't have been imagined just a decade ago. The digital education system revolutionized the old chalk and board process of learning in classrooms and threw it far beyond the boundaries of brick and mortar institutions and universities. At the same time, it also brought a great opportunity at the doorstep of universities and institutions to become the campuses of the future. The millennials can easily recall their early days when it was not much up to them on what, how, and when they study. However, this digital era has given them the golden opportunity to demand a personalized educational environment with a heightened amount of choice and instant access to good quality educational content that supports their need to upskill and learn at their own pace, space, time, and discipline. To acknowledge and meet these growing needs, today's session brings together the experts from the field of education and technology to discuss the crucial need and demand of digitally advanced ecosystem that delivers a personalized and high quality educational experience to the students of the 21st century. To throw more light on the same, we have with us today Mr. Siddharth Banerjee, Managing Director of Pearson India and Asia, who will be delivering the keynote address, which will be followed by a panel discussion. Without any further delay, I now invite Mr. Banerjee to deliver the keynote address. Over to you, Mr. Banerjee.
Thank you, Shambhavi. So Dharmraj had done this dry run, and I'm assuming that the screen is visible to all. And now I'm going into full screen mode, hoping that technology holds us together. A very, very good morning to all the eminent panel across many different paths and many different educational institutions across India. It's a privilege to be here. What I'm going to share in broadly the next 5 minutes is essentially a couple of thought starters. As Pearson, we intend to be, of course, we are a global learning and education company, building ourselves even more relevant to the 21st century learner. But what we aimed to be as part of the education and learning space is to be a forum, a platform, a catalyst, and a responsible voice in the room. And we can only be that, and we can only partner institutions and learners if we listen to them very intently. So here's a quick snapshot of how we do that listening in very, very intently across the globe. We run a fairly comprehensive survey called the Pearson Global Learner Survey. And every couple of months, this survey tells us in terms of what's happening in the lives of learners, which is people who want to educate themselves or upskill themselves across the many different countries that we operate in as a global company. Some of this is very, very intuitive. We can see these changes happening, whether it is more than half of the students wanting to reconsider their career paths, wanting to take interest in entrepreneurship, almost 90% of students wanting higher educational institutions to teach skills that are relevant to the 21st century, whether it's AI, ML, data analytics, etc. We know some of these trends are already happening, and each one of the eminent panel can see it in many different ways playing out in your own respective spheres. The push towards digital, the push towards access through smart devices are something that we all know, especially in India and especially in these last two pandemic-ridden years. But what's also interesting are two more pointers that come out from this survey. The fact that higher education is also seen as an engine for economic recovery, a point which is very pertinent to all of us who know that education is a way of moving up the socioeconomic ladder. Second, very interesting fact that comes out, as we become increasingly a global village, English is being seen as the gateway, and more people are realizing that you can have careers working across different industries and different countries, and therefore English as a linked language becomes rather important. There is also a section of the survey that then focuses on women in workforce. And again, some of the salient pieces that are coming out bear in mind of what's happening in the larger student level, where 81% of the women are using the opportunity of reflection to reevaluate their lives and careers. Now, some of this has implications in the way that we design our learning courses, the skills that we offer to learners of the future. And also it enables us to empathize with what's going on in their minds. So for example, if I were to draw your attention to the bottom right part of this chart, you have the top 3 stressors amongst the women that we considered, being of financial stability, health and wellness, overall, and then specifically coming to mental health. And all these are things that we know about as being in the field of education and learning. Coming to India, I won't spend time on the statistics. We know this, but very clearly the shift towards digital is irreversible. Not because we want it on this panel, but because consumers are already there due to convenience, ease of access, anytime learning, access to a wider variety of content, and so on and so forth. The second thing that we have picked up in conversation with learners is that quality of content is the most important driver of their decision making for which platforms they will seek to learn from. Of course, it's followed by convenience of use, affordability, etc. Assessment is a big topic of conversation today amongst the faculty as well as amongst the learners. And we know this from conversations with panels like these, that today digital materials are on the rise because they allow learners to learn in ways that are relevant to them. So bite-sized, video, on-demand doubt solving, etc. are becoming increasingly important. We know this, that COVID has turned out to be the chief digital transformation officer. And so therefore it's accelerated how consumer behavior has changed in many different aspects of life, including in the way people learn and absorb. But at the same time, there is also an increased role of institutions as well as of teachers and professors, so that they are able to help this 21st century learner in terms of the need that they have for getting upskilled, for getting quality assessments, and for getting personalized coaching or personalized learning. And I think that's what technology also allows. We know intuitively that each learner learns differently. Today, technology has the possibility of allowing for mass customization at scale. Where do we come in? Last 2-3 charts. We come in as being connected to learners, connected to institutions, and connected to providing tools and pathways for skilling and employability. For learners, we offer things like Pearson Plus, just launched in the US, Pearson Test of English, one of the biggest standardized AI-based tests in the world, used for work, visa, and migration purposes, and of course, access to some of the best authors in the world. For institutions, we partner for digital tools, and I'll talk about one of them. And skilling and employability, we have tracks called BTECs and apprenticeships, and we also offer things like the Pearson Versant, which is a test of English for corporations. I spoke about Pearson Plus, but I'll only leave it at a trailer basis. We've just launched this digital platform in the US, where it is our digital platform which is aimed at higher education institution students and making their lives simpler, and for them to have access to our best courseware on demand through a subscription service. What do we have in India, I'd like to draw your attention as the last chart to something called the Pearson e-library, which is our digital library solution where we partner with multiple institutions from the IIT, IIMs to the private universities, almost 300 institutions across India. And that's something that we have seen a huge acceleration and a huge uptake for, especially in the last couple of quarters. We'll talk more of this perhaps in the session that we have, but just like to leave you with this thought: as we make ourselves even more relevant to the 21st century higher education ecosystem and indeed to the 21st century learner. With that, I'll take a pause and thank you again for being part of this absolutely brilliant panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. We now have a power-packed panel of experts to discuss the urgent need and demand of digitally advanced ecosystem that delivers a personalized and high-quality educational experience to the students. I'm delighted to introduce the esteemed panelists. We have with us today Mr. Siddharth Banerjee, Managing Director, Pearson India and Asia, Professor Rishikesh T. Krishnan, Director and Professor of Strategy, IIM Bangalore, Professor Niharika Vora, Vice Chancellor, Delhi Skills and Entrepreneurship University, Professor C. Rajkumar, Founding Vice Chancellor, OP Jindal Global University, Professor Yajulu Meduri, Vice Chancellor, Mahindra University, Professor Jarugu Narasimha Murthy, Director, Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Professor G. Sundar, Director, BITS Pilani, Hyderabad Campus, Professor Rudra Pratap, Founding Vice Chancellor, Plaksha University, Professor P.C. Joshi, Pro Vice Chancellor, Delhi University, and the session will be moderated by Ms. Yogja Singh, Senior Associate Director, HR at KPMG India. Without further delay, I now invite Yogja to take it from here. Over to you, Yogja.
Thank you, Shambhavi. Very, very delighted to be moderating this session with such a prestigious panel out here. Now, with the pandemic, campuses of the future are set to change in ways which are very transformative, incremental, and disruptive. And our eminent panelists here are all experts and thought leaders in the field of education. Their views and inputs on how this landscape of campuses will evolve as we progress towards the future will be immensely valuable. I'm going to start with my first question to Professor Rudra Pratap. Given this whole talk about digital tech education, how do you think, Professor Rudra Pratap, will the landscape of technology education evolve, and what are the needs to change? What needs to really change for it to be more future ready?
Good morning, Yogja.
Good morning, Professor. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to the panel, and this is a great question. Tech education has changed a lot over last 200 years, where engineering education started in late 18th century to where it came in by the end of 20th century. And then there was a lot of churn that are we doing the right things? Students have become far more theoretical. They are taking a lot of theoretical knowledge, but the practice is missing. Industries started shouting and screaming. So with that, again, the pendulum has started swinging on the other side, that you got to do a lot more, practical work or hands-on work. But be as it may, these are all things about going between theory and practice. But the foundations of engineering education or tech education themselves have changed completely over the last 10, 15 years. What was considered foundations of engineering are no more sufficient for producing engineers of the future. So machine learning or artificial intelligence today for all engineers is as essential as linear algebra or differential equations were in the past. And therefore, this forms part of foundational knowledge. We used to do 3 courses of physics or 3 courses of chemistry and stuff like that. A lot of that was information centered. You don't need information to be conveyed in class. Information is available readily, and therefore that can take a back seat, and you can condense all that information or the fundamentals in one or two courses and introduce these new things in the new tech education which is required. As I said, whether it's AI, ML, efficient programming. Also, learning by doing has new meaning. Learning by doing doesn't only mean that you work on machines. Bunch of simulation tools are available in class. Not that you have to run to a lab. What used to be running to computer lab to do your computer experiments, it's right on your desk. So these things have changed tremendously how we learn. Now you have virtual labs. So with all of this, what we can do today, which we couldn't do previously, is introduce our students to grand challenges early on. Okay, grand challenges of society, whether it's about energy, water, environment, health, whatever it is, you can do that. So with that, interdisciplinarity comes in, students understand that, and access to experts, peers, problems, and labs, which is what a campus used to give. Now this access is global. So whoever can marshal these resources faster will come out on top. That's what I have to tell you.
Thank you, Professor Dhruvatap. We also have with us Professor P.C. Joshi here, and given that you've been speaking about technology, there are a lot of, my next question will be to Professor P.C. Joshi, which is really about a lot of tech giants, moving in the direction of creating their own specialized and very employment-focused higher education content. Example or case in point are some of the career certificates that have been launched by Google. What impact do you think, Professor Joshi, this could have on the future of campuses in higher education?
Well, I think the future of campus is going to be quite different than what traditionally we have been having, and especially after this advent of national education policy. I see a paradigmatic change that is going to happen across the campuses, because now I think the difference between public universities and private universities is going to be minimized, and the students would be, I think, empowered and would be given more freedom to go across. And so this is one way things are going to change. The campuses are going to be now more, I would say, more wide in terms of the space. And you have, not only the campuses across India, but also maybe beyond India. We are thinking of these campuses across public institutions, but also private institutions, private universities. I have got Rajkumarji sitting here from a very illustrious private university, Jindal, Global Jindal. Now, this is going to be one thing that is happening. Secondly, I think students are going to be even more freedom, and education is going to become more relevant, and relevant not only to make them better citizens, but also I think increase the employability, which is a very crucial, I think, goal of education as far as India is concerned. So in all, if you look at now at Delhi University, we are gearing ourselves to have and adopt national education policy from next year. And we have had a lot of discussions and debates around how we're going to do, how are going to, accommodate academic bank of credits, how are going to have multiple entry and exit, which is going to be a very exciting experiment as far as students are concerned. And now that we are going to have no more extracurricular, but it's going to become co-curricular, and students are, truly going to be given that real education, which was defined by Manabhatta in Kadambari, 64 arts, so there is no difference between art, science, engineering, music, sports, NCC. They are going to come together. I think we are going to create global citizens out of our students in the coming days. And that is what I think India is trying to do. But at the same time, we are also going to rediscover our roots, our traditions, our heritage. So this is a very, very, like unique thing that is going to happen. So campuses are going for a massive, drastic change in the coming days.
Thank you, Professor Joshi. Uh, since you talked about the concept of real education and being in touch with our grassroots, my next question is going to get directed to Professor Meduri, where essentially we are trying to understand how is the you know future of campuses, the campuses of the future, as we say, or higher education as it's changing. How is it very uniquely poised to take active responsibility in the development of the potential of all humans, considering this evolution, Professor Madhuri?
Thank you, Yogja, and a very good morning to all my esteemed panelists. It's a delight to be here today. In one way, major disruptors always bring about change. And so, however, some systems remain more resilient and resistant to transformation. So is that going to be the case with the Indian higher education system vis-a-vis the global system? If you look at it from the student body point of view, this is going to increase in diversity over the coming decades. People from a broad range of age groups. Okay, we're not going to be confined only to the lower ones. Cultural contexts and professional backgrounds, thanks to NEP, will now engage with higher education, each with their own specific motivations, needs, expectations. So underpinning all this shift is going to be the demographic and socio-economic trends also, which will affect higher education on a really, really massive global scale. Diversity in age, background means that different student groups will have distinct expectations of their educational path and their experiences in campus. Some will enter education for the first time, while others will need to update their skills while working or need to invest in a change of career. And we're seeing this happening already over the last 18 months. This trend means it's going to call for more flexibility in curricula, which will be reflected in a greater need for the continuous adaptation of learning facilities. In this context of rapid change and uncertainty, lifelong learning, as mentioned by a previous speaker, is becoming a key requirement for employability and job retention, as well as a significant contributor to profitability and wider economic growth. Profitability because, after all, private higher education is increasing in India like anything. Training, upskilling is increasingly fragmented, with the rise of micro qualifications or badges, as we call it, that certify competence on a skill by skill basis. These can be flexibly stacked to personally curate professional profiles. All this means change. And the past 18 months, we have seen the world's first borderless university, if I may call it, launch at a time when value of peer-to-peer engagement is being challenged to its core. And despite yet to turn out to be the revolution which the MOOCs have said they will become, providers are becoming ever significant key partners in this growth of the world's top universities. But if I may pause here and say, if you look at UK and look at the number of students who have enrolled in Coursera enrollments, it's only about 10% of them who have completed these Coursera courses. Many attribute this to the lack of a shared social experience and the reinforcing motivation that comes with this. These are intrinsic characteristics of the on-campus experience, which one cannot forget in any way at all. So if you look at the immediate future, traditionally, universities have used their physical and cultural presence to deliver students opportunity to create communities through social bonds, develop cultural competencies, and cross-fertilize ideas to learn from each other and gain unique experiences. And this, I think, is a very important part one has to keep in mind. Because for those coming from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, campuses can be places where disparities are equalized. These are now resurfacing in the virtual world. I just going to end with the statement with John Cisco, the CEO of John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, made quite way back. He said, if you don't innovate fast, disrupt your industry, disrupt yourself, you'll be left behind. I think that's the thing we got to watch out for. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Madhuri. Before we move on to our next panelist, anybody has any observations or any inputs that they'd like to pitch in with?
Yeah, I have a point. I just wanted to contest one thing that Professor Rudra Pratap said. And I really struck by his statement that AI and ML are as fundamental as linear algebra and some other topics that he mentioned. I'm not an engineering professor or a science professor, but I'm a little doubtful about that proposition. But it's just a small quibble with, many other things he said I agree with, but this is one thing I have some doubts about.
We can discuss that. Yeah.
May I, Yoga?
Sure, Professor.
Just as it happens, I share an alma mater with each of Professor Rudra Pratap and Professor Rishikesh Krishna. Professor Rudra Pratap, I preceded you by a year at Cornell, and Rishikesh Krishna, I preceded you by about a decade at IIT Kanpur. I don't know which of you is going to be right, but I would place my bets on Professor Rudra Pratap. And I just asked my colleagues in computer science to see whether computer science does not deserve at least as much of the space and room as mathematics does, at least in the science and technology category.
I also see Professor Rajkumar wanting to come in. Professor Rajkumar, over to you.
I'll keep it short. Well, Professor Majuri's point and also the larger context, I want to share a bit of perspective. I do get concerned that somehow universities need to mimic corporations and companies and business enterprises. I want to fundamentally contest any argument, not that Professor Majuri said that, but any correlation to what a university does and compare it to a corporation or a company or a business enterprise is actually death knell to the future of education and the future of universities. Secondly, I will say that we should be extremely conscious of ensuring the not-for-profit character of universities. Universities are not corporations. They are not working on the basis of EBITDA. They cannot be assessed and measured their contributions in any of those forms. They are supposed to be contributing to common good fundamentally, and that is expected for their future. So we need to be extremely conscious that now with privatization of higher education, where the state is slowly abdicating its responsibility towards all forms of education, I worry about the future in which somehow we can mimic universities to be some sort of a corporation. And there is a lot written about it, but we'll keep it for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Professor Murthy, you also want to come in. Please go ahead.
I think I would like to follow up with what Professor G. Sundar said. He said that he connects to the previous two speakers, and I would like to say that I connect with all the three. I come from IISc Bangalore, and I've been at IIT Kanpur for 2 decades teaching there, and of course came to this particular institution about 2.5 years back. I would like to sort of get back to what Professor Rudra Pratap said. There's no question. It's a sweeping statement. The COVID pandemic has taught us a lot of things, and the technology has become order of the day. It seems as though that without technology, we'll not be able to sort of do anything. So it is definitely, undoubtedly, unquestionably, unequivocally a very augmenting system in higher education learning experience. There's no question about it. He said that it's required everywhere, be it in simulations or be it in learning how a particular thing works and things like that. But when it comes to practice, unfortunately, I have a differing view. For example, yesterday we had a cricket match. Everybody could talk about how you seam a ball and how you bring about in swing, out swing, and things like that. Watch a number of videos, but at the end of the day, you have to execute. So when it comes to execution, to what extent is basically this, whatever you see becomes practical is a different thing. In fact, I can reflect on my own experiences here, heading this institution. We latched on to, it's a past, but I would not like to take much of time, but let me sort of briefly say what I want to say. We latched on to, digital teaching, and everybody was caught unawares, and the ministry told us that we must get on with, and education cannot be disrupted. And it has become order of the day within about a year and a half. There's no question about it. The students have begun to, come back to the campus. Now, it has allowed us to basically reflect on to what extent what we put out there in the form of the videos, engaging with the students in whatever, the digital space, the faculty dealing with them and trying to sort of satisfy their questions and things like that. You can pose questions, whatever that we have taught, to what extent has it really, translated Is there any analysis of that? I think Mr. Banerjee gave a very good analysis of how basically the digital education is transforming the world across. There's no question. Even women want to come back. But at the same time, if you look at experimental science, research, be it science or technology, ground realities are unfortunately very different. Right? I would like to quote this from NAP, which is a beautifully articulated document in my own perspective. I think there is a lot of effort that has gone into it. A vibrant campus life is essential for high quality teaching and learning process. No matter what kind of a technology that you have, but at the end of the day, I think engagement with teachers is indispensable. I'll get back to this particular point later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. Professor Rudra Pratap, would you want a concluding statement on this? Please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So Professor Krishnan, thank you for raising that question. The statement I made is rather well thought out. It's not a casual remark. Linear algebra or differential equations or things like that, engineers use as a tool for solving problems, for innovating things. So when you think about tools that we need today, for addressing major problems, AI, ML are also part of the same kind of tools. And actually they are turning out to be far more powerful tools because there are many of the other aspects built into them already, other tools built into them already. And this empowers engineers to do far more than what we could do just with basic tools of mathematics. That's all I wanted to add. And that's why I said that it's as fundamental.
Thank you, Professor Rudra Pratap. Interesting discussion. And I do know that Professor Rajkumar here spoke about universities contributing to the greater social good. And taking a cue from that, my next question is actually going to be to Professor Krishnan here, Rishikesh Krishnan, about, how do you think, Professor Krishnan, campuses of the future or higher education institutions, how they're emerging as front runners in really tackling the climate crisis and other global challenges?
That's a great question. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think one thing is pretty clear that there are a lot of big forces which are kind of outside our control, but which we need to address proactively. And climate change is certainly one example of that. I think the first role campuses can play is by being good role models. And I'm happy to see that happening in many campuses now, whether it be rainwater harvesting, internal energy or power generation using solar or other non-conventional energy sources. Many campuses now are becoming good examples of managing everything internally and also being kind of zero adders to global warming, or at least having targets in that direction. So the first point I would make is that campuses need to be excellent role models, because students spending time on campus need to see and be part of that environment so that they internalize that going forward. The second important element is, of course, bringing some of these complex challenges into the curriculum, which is a little more complicated in my view. It is there in bits and pieces, but sometimes not in the mainstream. For example, if I were to look at a discipline like economics, I would find that environmental economics perhaps deals with some of the climate change related issues in a sort of frontal way. But traditional economics tends to leave it just as an externality to be corrected by some policy measures. And perhaps that doesn't really put enough focus on some of the challenges which we see in the arena of climate change. So the summary of this is essentially that issues like this need to come more into the mainstream of curriculum across the entire portfolio of courses that we offer. The third important dimension of this is from an ethical, social, and political perspective. I think clearly many of these issues have strong ethical overtones as well. But in many of our academic programs, we tend to leave out ethical issues, at least in the core class discussion, leaving that once again to philosophy or other classes to handle. But I think some of these ethical issues, again, need to come really into the center of the curriculum, because unless we all take highly responsible positions, both as individuals and organizations, we will not be able to collectively address some of these challenges. So I think the sort of overall summary of this is that there are changes which need to happen across. They need to happen with professors being willing to embrace many of these challenges in a more fundamental way and bring them into the teaching and the research and the curriculum. And I hope we'll see more of that going forward. The good news is I see that industry is increasingly quite concerned about these issues. We have many top corporations, whether they be Unilever or ITC or many other companies in India, who are embracing these issues. We have seen two of the largest industrial groups, both the Reliance as well as the Adani Group, embracing green as a major strategic initiative going forward. Hopefully, with all of this, we'll see more of this coming into the academic curriculum as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krishnan. With that, I'm going to go back to Professor Murthy. He talked about the NEP. And Professor Murthy, my question to you is really in the context of NEP, what, according to you, are some of the opportunities and pitfalls to be considered specifically by institutions of science? Professor Murthy, you're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, when you speak of institutions, of course, it's a loosely used word, and we can refer to universities as well. And we can pose this question: what are these universities? Basically, centers meant for imparting quality education, training, inculcating some kind of creative thinking, sort of imparting some kind of an objective and analytical skills at the end of the day, where everything comes down to quality education. In fact, if you look at NEP, I think I have some statistics here. Quality education, this is a 64 pages document, features at least 27 times in higher education, which is very important. In fact, it's a quality education that is critical for knowledge creation. It is a knowledge creation which allows any nation to sort of prosper. So it all comes down to ensuring that we are not let down in terms of providing quality education to the clientele, the younger generation. There's no question. NAP, let me limit myself to scientific institutions. I think there is Professor Rudra Pratap there, and who can talk about the technological institutions. But otherwise, more or less, they go hand in hand. If you look at basically the growth of science in our country, let us limit again ourselves to India. It's only in the last, critically, if you analyze, 5 to 6 decades that science has begun to flourish. As a chemist myself, in 1980s, late 90s was when I got my PhD from the Ministry of Science. Publishing some kind of a quality paper in top tier, let us say American journals, was like wow. I mean, you go around the country, you would not find even a few. And if anybody published in Science and Nature was a hero, no question about that. Even a few who could publish routinely, even in lower rung publications, was considered excellent. But with flow of funding, the educational infrastructure landscape has tremendously changed in the last 20 years. Let us accept the fact that some of the institutions like ISER that I'm heading is nothing less to any of the foreign universities that you see in terms of the infrastructure. Everything pretty much what one can do there can be done here. And which has basically sort of elevated our standards in terms of scientific research. And the people ask us, how much of money is really getting into the scientific institutions? Why is it that we do not even have a Nobel laureate from a country with such vast population? I have a counter for that. It's only in the last 4 or 5 decades that we have actively begun to do quality science. In fact, more precisely, only in the last 2 decades or 2.5 decades. I think you have to allow that time for our science practitioners to mature. Just when, of course, we have been disrupted by this particular one, the pandemic, and we are talking about basically technology changing the learning paradigm, learning experience. And I said it already, there's no question. To the extent that it augments, I buy that. But when someone says that technology is completely going to swamp and you don't need any practical experience, I think that is absurd. right? So technology is absolutely supports, augments our learning experience. There's no question about that. Now, NEP is something that is talked about for quality education. Let's come back to the question of quality education. It has beautifully identified what actually is this quality education, what are the aims of that. Let me read this out here. Quality higher education must aim to develop good, thoughtful, well-rounded, and creative individuals. This is the overall objective. I think the NEP team has done a marvelous job and identified tremendously the lacuna with our education system, and come up with a lot of recommendations. And this is the question that you are posing to me. I'm sorry if I'm taking more time, but because all of us teach and we have this tendency of going overboard, right? Unfortunate it is. I think if Professor Rudra Pratap is smiling, and that's the way it is. And recommendations. What are the things that you asked the question of opportunities, and you said demerits? I would not like to say demerits. Rather, I would say what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And let me take the foremost thing. Why is it that our university system, we keep talking about it, has basically eroded in terms of quality? Simply because the faculty quality is really poor. Now, here is where NEP has a recommendation. And it advocates the policy of tenure track for faculty. Otherwise, if you want to fire somebody, the institutions will get embroiled. You cannot really take any action on the people that are deficient, non-performers, incompetent. You have no mechanism. I think the institutions, higher education institutions, should embrace this tenure track mechanism, whereby an opportunity exists for weeding out the people that are irrelevant to the system, because every institution should look to upgrade itself, right? That's one opportunity. And the second is internationalization. It's I must say, I think there are a lot of players from private organizations here. It's not that I'm against private organizations, because they're out there and they have to basically sort of sell themselves to the society. And there are a variety of teams to sort of help them out to focus on what is relevant for the society. I think one has to gauge the mood of the younger generation, the learning clientele. And if you don't do that, if you miss out on basically sort of feeling the pulse of the younger generation, I'm afraid the educational institutions will be pushed into wilderness. I think the standing example is Nokia. In spite of being really in the forefront, up until about 12 years back, it's invisible now. And admittedly, by then, they lost out in sensing the pulse of the consumer, and which is basically the challenge for higher education institutions, right? Gone are those days that IIT Kanpur, I think several come from IIT Kanpur, was a fantastic institution, and the students from nook and corner would flood to IIT Kanpur, but it's no longer the case. Right? I think there are educational institutions that reach out to the taste of the needs of the student community. Right? There is a changing paradigm. I think the educational institutions have to take that into consideration. Particularly worry about the curriculum, structuring the curriculum with a wide possibilities. I think the palette of programs for the institute and the students should be vast, should be expanded, which is exactly what the NEP's recommendation is. I think the institution should embrace this and open up and look to expand the programs. And at the same time, those supposedly sick institutions can have the opportunity for them to reorient themselves in the name of NEP and restructure the curriculum, right? It talks about, interdisciplinary education, multidisciplinary education, or restructure the curriculum and open up some new disciplines and look to orient and see if they can basically come out of that. Of course, some institutions that are supposedly elite, like, for example, IIT and ISIS, which have brand names, can look to sort of sit on this knowledge pyramid, probably navigate a path for lower rung institutions to inculcate the flavor of research, because it advocates research at every level, right? Be it collegiate or university education. I think research is the way forward. And given that, and of course, funding is another one, and NEP also has mooted the National Research Foundation, NRF, and I suppose that there will be liberal funding. And given that, I think the top-rung institution should assume this role and navigate that path for the lower-rung institution. There's a beautiful opportunity there. Coming to challenges, right? The curriculum, right? I think private organizations, I'm sure, will do really well, but then there is always a resistance to change in the government organizations. But I think they have to really emerge from long practiced kind of protocols and present themselves as sort of destinations. The curriculum has to become, because the younger generation is a highly tech savvy, and routine and monotonous kind of brute force way of basically education does not work today. And restructuring the curriculum that I talked about. And NEP also advocates what is called as academic banking credit ABC in the name of. This is where the challenge is. It talks about portability of the credits from one institution to the other institution. Our country is complex. We have a high hierarchy. In fact, even we have NIRF ranking system, which basically sort of arranges in the current day, the educational institutions in different ranking system. And some pride about, in fact, the brand name itself. No matter how good or bad a particular candidate is, but he or she can get hold of a job based on the institution that he or she comes from. In such a complex scenario, right? And this is where the problem is, and this is where the challenge for the education institutions is. How are you going to sort of accept some candidate who has done some courses somewhere but would like to re-enter in the second year or third year in another organization which is far away? How does this work? Right? The credit transport, right? Transfer of the credit system is a really challenge. They have to come up with this. And much more challenging is the NEP advocates that any duration of education has to have some recognition. And it goes on to the extent of saying that somebody who is registered for the bachelor's degree with 1 year of education should be able to get a certificate, whatever, and 2 years, I think he deserves to be given a diploma, and 3 years a bachelor's degree. And of course, if you have a research component built into it, 4 years with whatever name that education. Full autonomy it advocates for the educational institutions. In terms of awarding the degrees, in terms of structuring the curriculum, if every institution has the autonomy in terms of structuring the curriculum, how is it that we have some kind of a common platform for this transportability? Again, I come back to that. Right? There are problems with this. And of course, integration of humanities and arts with STEM is a complex thing. A holistic education necessarily warrants that the education in arts and humanities is somehow built into science and technological education. Right? Having taught for 2 decades at IIT Kanpur, I know for myself, if I am basically taking a class for about 700 or 800 first year BTech students, it's very difficult to push any chemistry content into their head, which is compulsory in the first year. I'm sure all of those who come from IIT system know this. How is it that we basically force upon students that seek technology, some humanities courses, some science courses? It's a really complex thing. Yes, the intention is good. We would like to sort of create well-rounded professionals for tomorrow. But how can you really thrust all these things into the minds of the students is a huge challenge. I think I can go on, but I think in view of time, I would like to restrict myself, and then I'll get back at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. With that, I'm going to bring in Professor Rajkumar, and my question to him is actually going to be about, what do you think, Professor Rajkumar, is really the fundamental character of higher education and campuses of the future? Is it changing as we advance towards the future?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Economic Times, for putting this panel together. Well, I realize we have another 25 minutes, so I'm going to keep it very short, and there's so many people waiting here. I'll keep it really within 3 minutes. First of all, I believe that physical campus learning is here to stay, and we will have to reimagine itself. Online and blended education will play an important role, but it will supplement the role played by physical learning experiences. Second, I think undergraduate education will remain a very important part of physical learning experiences, although it'll have to be integrated with digital platforms, and technology will enhance the entire learning experiences, which is very different from, let's say, postgraduate education, as well as executive education, and even continuing education, and also professional education for those who are already in the workforce. The third is that technology, I believe, will drive an entire range of allied dimensions of campus experience. For example, entrance examinations is a very good area. I strongly believe there is a case for all entrance examinations for entry into universities to be conducted in an online manner. In fact, just before COVID, we never did any entrance examination in an online manner. In fact, Pearson View is here. We work with Pearson on all our entrance exams. And now I cannot imagine that we will ever do an entrance examination physical. We have this AI-enabled remote proctored examination model, and we're going to do that. Even post-COVID, that's a decision we have taken. Fourth, the physical campus experience needs to have other components, and that's where we have to work a lot. Experiential learning, national and international exchange programs, immersion programs, study abroad programs, capstone projects. It's about the future of campus learning and how it can enhance the very experience of being a student. And the fifth is something that we have to talk a lot about, which is we need a complete overhaul of the regulatory architecture if you are serious about digital and online learning having any meaningful impact. The entire framework of faculty-student ratio, the existing model of, how many hours the student and the faculty will be together in terms of learning. I mean, we are working now with both Upgrad and Coursera, and I can tell you that the learning curve that institutions and faculty members have is quite extraordinary. And everything that we have so far believed in a physical learning experience need to be reimagined. Lastly, I think that there are things that online education cannot do, and we should be mindful of it and ensure that there are other ways to support this. First and most important is that ability to promote critical thinking abilities among students, among young people. Second is to infuse a sense of teamwork and collegiality, particularly among young school leavers. Third is about appreciating and celebrating diversity, the pluralism of our culture and our people, and how they engage together in a campus ecosystem. Fourth, of course, something that all of us know, developing an emotional quotient in terms of their own future. And the fifth, which is, I think, something which is less talked about, developing a holistic personality, including participation in sports activities and music and theater and dance and drama, and a whole range of campus activities that simply cannot happen virtually, or at least it's not the same thing. Lastly, I want to conclude by saying that, listen, I'm a very strong believer of holistic education, but I do worry that in India, there is a far too much emphasis on STEM and medicine education. I come from a place called Kanyakumari and grew up in Chennai, and every serious student there is expected to become a doctor or an engineer. And I belong to the three idiots generation. And by the way, we are still living the three idiots nightmare in the country. So I strongly support the need for promoting serious study of humanities and social sciences. While I have great respect for doctors and engineers, and my own family, including my mother, is one, I do think that this stepmotherly treatment, some sort of indifferent approach towards humanities and social sciences is not in the best interest of India and our future. NEP has talked about it, but I worry that the overwhelming emphasis in India on engineering and STEM continue to dominate our thinking and thought process, and we need to challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. And before I really move on, anybody has a view here that they would like to come in, given the statement that you've just made?
Yeah, I would endorse what Professor Rajkumar said. I think he summarized the advantages of the campus experience extremely well. I think one of the earlier speakers also mentioned to the challenges of you don't really get that much learning from peers in the online kind of environment. So I think clearly for certain parts of the education process, campus learning will continue to be important. And I would like to endorse what Professor Rajkumar said.
Thank you, Professor Krishnan. Professor Rudra Pratap, you'd raised your hand and I'll come back. I'll just come to you, Dr. Vora. We'll do that.
Yeah, I wanted to endorse what Professor Rajkumar said, that there is still no substitute of campus life, but campus life itself has to change according to what we have learned during this period, right? So as I said, that campus provides access to lots of other things other than classroom. It provides access not only to experts and teachers, but peers and different kinds of problems and labs. All of this can now explode, with help in technology. The whole world can become your lab, So we have to endorse that we can bring experts from all over the world to our campuses through this digital technology medium. We can bring labs, in India, just like you have fabulous companies in semiconductors, you can have labless research. You don't have to necessarily have all equipment in your place, which used to be the model. You can use labs around your city or your state, and you can leverage that, right? We can network these things. That's what we have to bring to the modern campus, right? And increase the access for students and make it global. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rudra Pratap. Over to you, Professor Niharika.
So thank you. I completely agree with you, Professor Pratap and Professor Rajkumar, for your points. I think not only do we need to start thinking about labless because it's possible, but as part of a skill university, I can definitely tell you that sometimes setting up a lab which will actually be the one that would train students for industry itself can be a losing proposition from the day you start to do it. If you have to spend 5 crores to set up a lab, and then it becomes completely obsolete in 4 to 5 years, then you are starting with something that you will never be able to keep up. So I think we really have to start thinking about how we train, how we set up labs, and how we actually get people to get the students to have a sense of the industry. The second point that I want to make, which I think is, often we talk about how do we do humanities for STEM. I think it's equally important to start thinking about how do we do STEM in humanities, because it almost seems like we only want to do humanities in STEM and not the other way around. Scientific temper is something that I think everybody needs to learn, irrespective of what subject you learn. And similarly, the liberal temper is also something that everybody needs to develop, irrespective of what you're learning. So I think it's a both, not just one.
Very pertinent point, Professor Niharika. Thank you. Oh, Professor Rajkumar, you would like to come in?
Yeah, just in some ways, what I really wanted to emphasize is also the fact that many things that we do in education cannot be measured, and what it gets measured need not always be counted, and what ought to count sometimes may not get measured. So in some ways, I'm all in favor of high quality science education, and we need to promote it. But I think it's like great engineers that we have and we should be able to help us build the next big bomb or aircraft or whatever we want to, or rocket. But we need thoughtful individuals deeply rooted in philosophy and history and sociology to ask the question whether we need those things at all. And so the importance of humanities education to have a civilizational impact and influence on our life, and that's the most important challenge that we are facing in humanity today. I mean, frankly speaking, what we are seeing, both in terms of the pandemic, but also the impending climate change crisis, is actually about our ability to mindlessly grow. And growth has limitations. And who is going to tell that to us? It is, with all due respect, not the engineers. It is going to be the philosophers, the sociologists, the anthropologists, the people who are steeped in traditions of literature. Those aspects need to be brought to a central focus, not like a high school principal or a teacher today across the million schools in India say, oh, your son is not so good, so maybe, he can go and go do history, and he's not good enough to study computer science, physics, chemistry, botany, zoology, mathematics. Since he's not good academically, let him or let her do history, political science, sociology, philosophy. We need to change that.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Professor Meduri, you would have a concluding comment on this. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, at the end of the day, I think we're talking too much of digital this thing. End of the day, we're human beings. We are relationship driven for everything. I still remember all of my colleagues are either IIT, etc. In IIT, we always used to look up to one or two of our faculty as the guides. We get everything onto a small laptop, onto a small mobile phone. We're cutting that out. We're cutting it out. Why do we want to deprive our younger generation of experiencing what we had experienced? I think that everybody should also remember. Thank you.
Very pertinent point. Thank you, panelists. Now, very interesting points that emerged from what Professor Rajkumar said, and some of our panelists have talked about it, is how technology should be providing allied dimensions to campus experience and the concept of pooled resources. So we will talk about both of these. And my first question around technology is actually going to get posed to Siddharth Banerjee here. Siddharth, how are really education companies supporting higher education ecosystem in building this whole digital infrastructure? You've talked about what Pearson's been doing. Would love to hear more.
Thank you, Yogja. So, I've spent many years, besides learning, of course, at some of the best higher educational institutions that the globe has to offer. But my foundational learning comes from meeting consumers across many years spent at Hindustan Lever, which is now Hindustan Unilever. And one of the things that is taught to us as young managers is the importance of the and agenda and the importance of logic and magic. What do I mean by that? Logic and magic is, and Professor Meduri spoke about relationships, and we are speaking about digital as a tool. So I think both need to coexist. The relationships, so we are human beings, we interact as people, but we are also requiring digital in the 21st century. Why is that? I was reading a fascinating article by Google, and here's a fun fact that might be useful for all of us to bear in mind. 15% of the searches that happen on Google, on the many millions and billions of searches that happen every day, 15% of them are brand new every day, which means that people are searching for things that they never searched for yesterday. 15% is brand new searches. Now that tells you about how dynamic our world is. And there is no way that anyone, educational institution or any person, will be able to adapt to this deluge and make sense out of all that information and translate the information into insights. And that's perhaps the role of technology in terms of deep learning. The role of relationships, on the other hand, is related to, again, what I learned many years back at Hindustan Lever, which is about ecosystems. Given education and learning, no one set of stakeholders can say that we can attempt to educate our large demographic dividend that we have, the youth that we have, and say that we will do it ourselves. It won't happen that way. We have got to figure out the role of the academic institution. And I think, like the eminent professor said, there is a certain role that they have, which is unique to that. There is a role that private institutions have, which is unique to that. And they need not converge. That's fine. And that is the brilliance of having an ecosystem approach where everyone brings their strength to the table. Coming back to the point that Yogja, you made, what excites me personally leading Pearson for this part of the world is the fact that we are able to participate with many eminent institutions across India. And specifically because of the digital acceleration, we have the e-library product that I spoke about. And we are getting real-time feedback from the 250 institutes that we speak with on a weekly basis. Like I said, whether it's the IIMs, the IITs, the private universities, I think every day we learn from those institutions and the learners. And that's something that we will talk more about in the times to come, the Pearson e-library product. So that's one. Last point that I want to leave behind is that I think it was fascinating listening into the fact that our skills need to go beyond, some of our conditioning. Professor Rajkumar spoke about the Three Idiots generation. I think it's very evocative. The statement is very evocative, that it go beyond medicine and engineering, as it were. And we are seeing our young generation doing that. I think it will be important to know how we can partner with the eminent institutions here to broad base those range of subjects. I myself am not an engineer or a doctor. I did the dismal science, which is economics, and I've seen the value of that in the world of business, but also in my own daily life. So I think for me, it's been very interesting listening in. Thank you again, and back to you, Yogja.
With that, my next question is going to be posed to Professor Sundar here. Professor Sundar, we spoke about the whole interconnectedness and the concept of pooled resources. So, do you think conceptualizing campuses of the future and higher education as an interconnected ecosystem would enhance collaboration and make it far more connected and accessible?
Yogya, I have a question first. Do we have a hard stop at 12:20?
We will have a hard stop by about 12:30, Professor Sundar.
Because Professor Vora has not spoken, and I think there has been, as Professor Rajkumar put, a greater proportion of time devoted to science and technology, and I happen to be a science person also. So let me, I'm going to sort of digress a little. I'm not disputing the need for and the importance of campus education in any manner whatsoever. I think it provides the wholesomeness that goes to complete education. And I have spent 34 years in an institute where most students have spent time, and perhaps the most quality time, as much outside the classroom as within the classroom and the laboratories. And this is something I think we can never take away from the campuses that are in a position to provide experiences of the sort that this panel is privileged to be from, and those institutions have the privilege of having members of this panel as faculty members on. But I think I would like to draw attention to the country at large. And I don't think that that is true of most other campuses. I might be wrong. I do understand that they do provide a certain kind of experience, but I dare say that that does not compare quite with the kind of academic experience that we would desire. And therefore, I think in that sense, I agree with one of the points that I believe Mr. Siddharth Banerjee made at the last of his interjections just now. So I will confine myself to a few of those aspects, as well as a response to some of the points that were raised during the course of the other panelists. And I would now rather pose this through a few examples. So the first thing is, I am speaking out of an experience which was not born out of the pandemic. The pandemic enhanced a certain part of that experience. And that's because I've been responsible also for providing education to a very large number of continuing education students who are located outside the campus, but to whom we try and provide as wholesome and as complete an education as we do on the campus. And I think in that context, as well as in the context of what I mentioned earlier, collaboration and this whole idea of an extended ecosystem becomes important. And that's mentioned in the UNESCO perspectives brought out in 2050, to educate higher institutes in 2050, brought out sometime earlier this year, as well as in the NEP in a couple of places, specifically 20.6 about the role of technical institutions and the need to collaborate with industry. and the role of the NETF, which is yet something to fructify. Now, collaboration has been an inherent part of the higher education ecosystem, though perhaps in certain restricted sense of the term. So I'm going to expand the ecosystem to include not just higher education institutions, but, like I dare say all of you who are much more learned than I am, have heard of the human microbiome. So there is a larger whole of which institutions, higher education institutions are a part. And I think there is a connection to be made with all of those too. And these include higher education institutions, industry organizations, industry bodies, research institutions, private research institutes, startups in particular, because there's an amazing amount of work that's going on in startups today, which I think is going to enable us to reach levels of excellence at a pace which is nothing compared to what we would have been able to do, and so on. So I think that's a context which Professor Vora will also bring up, being in charge of an institution of a very special kind. And of course, experts of all kinds from all walks of life. Now, one thing Professor Murthy did talk about, though Professor Murthy, I must tell you, I agree with Dr. Rajkumar that not only should the government play its key role by raising the levels of funding for education, both primary and higher, but I think that there should be more even-handed treatment of public and privately funded institutions. And Professor Rajkumar, believe me, much as I agree that EBITDA is not a very desirable term in academics, I pulled out a lot of my hair dealing with EBITDA over the last few years, because I also have to fund the research that happens. And we are a totally, and we're not a privately funded institution. We are an independent institution. So I have to raise every bit of the resource that I will have to invest in growth of the institution. Now, there are 2 or 3 ways I think that campuses, while maintaining the excellence, should recognize the need to invest in technology. One is, as has been emphasized, the younger generation has just completely transformed itself in the manner in which it consumes content. And I think that that is something that we should be prepared for in providing that content in a variety of ways, which suits the needs of as many types of students that there are, to the best of our extent. And I think, therefore, that investment in, and I don't mean only monetary investment in technology, but I mean also innovation in technology, is something that is critical. To just add to something that Professor Rudra Pratap said, sir, in order to not deprive, see, we run a very large suite of programs for professionals in industry. And these are formal education programs. And I'm happy to say we've graduated more from those programs than we have from the campus. But in order to provide them as close to an experience as we are able to here, of course, we also use the workplace as a laboratory for them. But we have, I believe we have created remote laboratories in at least 10 domains. And I would like sometime to invite you to look at one of those and perhaps give us a few more suggestions as to what we can do. And I'm even happier to say these are 24/7 laboratories. So students can book their slots online and access the lab at any time of day or night, 365 days a year. And I'm even happier to say that we did offer our services during the pandemic to a couple of other institutions, including one government institution. And I was particularly happy about that, though we did not say anything very much about it. So I think there is no question about the need for greater collaboration. There is an immense need for teacher training, and I think technology can play a fantastic role in doing that. For instance, in order to keep our industry manpower educated, we have created a large amount of digital content, as I'm sure most other institutions have. While I agree with Professor Murthy that simply making this content available to students from a variety of systems where they have designed their own curricula and so on is a challenge, I think using these for teacher training and thereby trying and raising the level of instruction as well as of exploration in institutions of a variety of standards in the country is something that the more privileged institutions should focus on, and I'm afraid, unfortunately, that's not happening. And I think it is our bounden duty to do that. And while much of that needs to be done by the government, I think there is a little bit that each one of us should also contribute towards that. I think I will close with that, except to say that I am very happy to announce that we did our online entrance examination in 2005. While I am myself not a particular fan of entrance examinations, and I think the entrance examination committee is the kind of culture has sort of undermined the school system. It's more a process of filtering out than filtering in most of the time. I'm happy to share our experience with others. Last but not the least, Professor Rajkumar, I will approach you because we have 8 units of humanities compulsory in our curriculum. But I still haven't figured out whether the students get a wholesome humanities experience or they really understand why they are doing the courses they do. So we need to collaborate for that also in order to be able to understand why it is we did it with a workshop, but I think we've not gone back and investigated again. So I think collaboration is, it's a necessary and integral part of all of education, and it's here to stay. And I just hope that we can expand the range and nature of collaborations. Thank you. I have taken more than my share of that.
Thank you, Professor Sundar. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to bring in Professor Vora here, and she also brings diversity to this group. And on a lighter note, as I would say, we are saving the best for the last. So Professor Vora, my question to you here is, we've spoken a whole lot about students, the ecosystem that we're trying to create, and we've also, and some facets touched about, how faculty has also been upskilling themselves and how this has been an opportunity for them. From your unique vantage point, what is your view and advice to institutions for enabling their faculty to be forward-thinking and focusing on their upskilling?
You are muted, Professor Vora.
So thank you. And of course, this question is a little different from what has been discussed. I was trained as a psychologist, and we jokingly say we convert everything into a 2x2 problem. I want to talk about this as not a 2x2, but as a 3-factor thing that needs to be looked at. The first factor that I think one needs to recognize is that the same program cannot be, the same faculty development needs do not exist for all faculty. So depending on the stage of faculty, so are you a new faculty? Are you somebody who's been teaching for some time? Are you somebody who's been tenured for the last 20 years? So there is a certain stage, and the needs for faculty development for each of these are very different. And you can't have one size fit all. The second is that even the faculty today, if you see our different generations, there are faculty who are almost like netizens. They are native users of technology. They grew up with technology. So they're the younger faculty. Then there are faculty like us who started using computers during our bachelor's or master's program. So we typed our own thesis in a way. And then there are faculty who are very, very late adopters of technology. So they basically still use technology as something that's just got to be used in that process. And of course, the teaching and learning needs of these faculty are very different, especially if you're looking at adoption of technology or even as to how they want to be trained during the programs. And the third, I think, is the other aspect is what do you focus on when you start to teach? When you start looking at faculty development? Do you look at the subject matter, which itself possibly needs to be updated for faculty? Of course, some of it we do it because we do research. The second is understanding of the real life whatever that real life is, and it's not only for science, but it's for all subjects, like whether it is history or geography or engineering or fashion design, it doesn't matter. There is a real life for which we are teaching for and doing research for. So some experience of that, some understanding of that. And the third, I think, is the whole aspect of pedagogy and also personal development. I find, again, there are the administrators or leaders of universities sometimes make assumptions for, what is the need for training, or who should be trained in what way. I think we need to create bouquets. We need to understand that different people will need different training. And we need to also push faculty to not just look at one type of training. And I think that would help us to have a better sense of what the faculty are consuming and are they really developing themselves, and then also sometimes nudge them to look at other aspects that they possibly don't look at. In my experience, a lot of faculty are very happy to consume content. They're also happy to consume sometimes industry, but anything that looks at themselves or their own personal and pedagogical is not really looked at. So I think that is one aspect that I'd like to say. So first, characterize your faculty and then figure out what kind of training to be given or adopted by them. And second, do not make assumptions for people as to what kind of training they need. And the third is, I think faculty must collaborate with each other for their own upskilling and growth. Because at the end of the day, we learn from the same community. And if there's a one-up personship in that itself, then there isn't a growth that is possible. So I think there's a possibility for reverse mentoring. There is a possibility for different aspects of the ecosystem who can mentor and grow faculty. So I would look at it again, like we would like to say for students, I'd also like this to be more holistic in the approach. So maybe I'll stop here. It's 12:29. I know you have a hard stop, and we can talk later about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vora. And, I think I personally learned from this discussion, very enlightening. Anybody who would like to make a concluding remark before we wrap this discussion up?
Quickly, I can say something. Well, you see, the thing is, one of the big challenges is digital learning needs to embrace how we can address the challenges of what all of us have pointed out. And there could be a lot of innovation. I do believe, for example, in science education, for a country which doesn't have enough resources, a lot of virtual laboratory experiences can be created. The question is, how do we take it to the next level on non-STEM and non-medicine areas?
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Professor Krishnan, you want to come in?
Yeah, I had just a slightly different point. I think we have lots of work to do. One of the concerns I have is, in the last year, I must have attended about 30, 40 panels like this. And while all of them were very edifying, no doubt, I think we should all get to work. I think one challenge is in India, I'm sorry, this is as a general remark, may not be very well appreciated, but I think we're very good at discussion, but sometimes we need action. So I'm just hoping that there'll be more action. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krishnan. Anyone else? Professor Vora, please go on.
I'm just saying, yes, I agree with it. We need to do more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, panelists, for your time and your views here. And then I'm going to hand this session back to the ET team. I thoroughly enjoyed, moderating this session. And like I said, I think there are takeaways for me personally and very enlightening. Over to you, Shambhavi.
Thank you, Yogya.
Thank you, Yogya, for taking us through such an enlightening session. It was an absolute pleasure to listen to such fantastic panelists. Before we conclude the session, I would like to express my gratitude to each of our panelists for making the time to join us here today and sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you once again for joining this session on Campus of the Future, powered by Pearson. We look forward to seeing you all for our future sessions. Have a nice day and stay safe. Thank you, everyone.